Most beginners buy the wrong longsword, and then they wonder why the sparring feels stiff, painful, or straight up impossible. And that's why I have to save you the months of frustration, because in HEMA, the longsword you choose changes everything. Hi, I'm Michael Kozin, and I have 2.5 years of constant experience in HEMA, specifically with longsword. I have experience with low gear and with full gear sparring. Also, I went to different tournaments and experienced it for myself. So I know how hard it is to actually start it and to train it consistently. I learned the hard way that wasting money at the beginning can decide if you'll stick to training this HEMA or not. That's why I've taught countless beginners on what to actually choose as their first training weapon. Inside my school community, I helped guys start their own sword fighting journey without any experience, especially gamers, because they get this stuff way faster than they think. I already helped 10 guys inside of this community, so you can join now and see it for yourself. So let's begin from the first longsword that every beginner should get, in my honest opinion, is Go Now padded longsword. This is a lightweight padded longsword, which is very safe for low gear practice and sparring. But of course, for this kind of sword, to be honest, all you need for sparring and training is just a fencing mask. The padded longsword is perfect for beginners because it teaches them right away that it's not about the sword that they wield or they choose. It's about their agility and their own finesse with a weapon. So this kind of sword is perfect for building the fundamentals that everyone needs to get to later on progress to another swords. This kind of sword teaches you the very fundamentals like distance, like footwork, timing, being relaxed at the same time. Also, this kind of sword lets you spar 10 times more since you don't need full armor to actually spar against another opponent. The most common mistake that I see beginners think is that because of it's padded, it's fake, but that's completely wrong. First of all, Go Now swords are the safest risk-free swords to actually train your sword fighting skills. So the fundamentals. It teaches you how to behave with an object in your hands. You can train footwork, you can train cuts, different directions of cuts, but also basic defense like parrying, riposting. So if you want fast progress and no fear, this sword is for you. So the second type of a sword that I often see Americans use is a synthetic sword, which unfortunately I don't own. It's kind of a mid-step between a padded and a steel longsword. So a synthetic sword is a hard plastic simulator which behaves a bit more like a real steel longsword. This kind of sword is good only for structured drills. The main downside about synthetic swords is that they are not more safe than the steel ones in sparring specifically. So synthetic swords require of you to have the same amount of full gear equipment as for a steel longsword, which isn't ideal. But still, this kind of sword teaches you a real geometry of a blade without the risk of steel. To be honest with you, I don't really see anyone using it for sparring, even with full gear. So it's kind of a different, suboptimal a bit of a sword, in my honest opinion. So synthetic swords are kind of a, in my honest opinion, is kind of useless because if you don't own any synthetic sword, then you don't really need one. So synthetic swords are kind of a weird mix between padded longswords and steel ones, but they need a lot more protection than the padded swords. But the main benefits of synthetic sword is that they're cheaper, they are durable, and they are a bit of a good bridge between a padded longsword and a steel longsword. The mistake that I often see beginners do is that they jump from zero to the steel right away. So if you own a synthetic sword, then don't go to the steel one right away, because you'll not learn the fundamentals of sword fighting. Of course, the best way to learn sword fighting experience is to actually spar another opponent, through which you'll learn from your mistakes 5 times quicker than just doing solo drills. Of course, the synthetic sword is also very nice for different solo drilling, like cuts, like thrusts, like shadow fighting, imagining that you're fighting an opponent, and also combining it with your footwork drill to merge your blade work with your footwork. So, as I said, my personal advice is that you don't spend your money on this sword, because it's not really a requirement for you to actually learn the sword fighting techniques and skills. So, the third and the last type of sword for sparring is the Federschwert, the steel longsword made for full gear sparring. This is a steel sparring sword designed for full HEMA gear, which behaves like a real historical longsword. This kind of sword and a realistic medieval sword uh, differs a bit, because it's made for safe thrusting. So, for example, when I do a thrust into my opponent and I hit him, then my blade would actually flex a bit. And it's made for just safety, right? We don't want to kill our sparring partner. We want to hit him and make sure that we don't hurt him. So Federschwerts are the standard for HEMA tournaments all over the world. It has beautiful balance and the same handling as a real medieval replica of a longsword would have. So it behaves the same as a real longsword. But of course, it has a bit of different design. As you can already see, the blade of the Federschwert has this thing called shield to actually thin down the blade to make it more safe for thrusting purposes. So it still has two blades, which are of course blunt, because we don't want to cut our sparring partner to pieces. And also the point of the sword, so the punta in Italian, is also round to not penetrate the gear of our partner, right? As you can see, the point of balance of the Federschwert is around 5 or 6 centimeters to crossguard. So the weight distribution is really comfortable for every fighter, because, as I said, longswords weren't heavy, and some of them have different designs in history, right? But real battlefield like swords, as they were sidearms, not main weapons, they were pretty comfortable to actually fight with and to not lose your strength right away. So this specific Federschwert, my Federschwert, has a total length of 125 centimeters, which was the standard for 15th century longswords at the time. And sometimes Federschwerts even go up to 135 centimeters, which is the usual length for every tournament Federschwert. So the requirements that you have to get good at before you start to wield a steel longsword is to get good at controlling the fight generally, and being good at footwork. Also, not flinching and panicking under the real pressure of combat. So this kind of sword, as I said, unlocks for you to train safely thrusting mechanics, but also when you're sparring as well. The beginner mistake that I did myself is that I bought this sword before I even started HEMA, which is which is pretty funny, right? I wouldn't even recommend you getting this sword if you're just a beginner. Even if you're a beginner to intermediate level, I'd still think about not buying this sword right away, but building yourself up through repetitions and training, then buying this sword with the full HEMA gear equipment. So still feels amazing, but only when you're prepared for it. So extra section that I want to tackle is that what most beginners do completely wrong. My first point is that they copy the video games logic, which is fancier sword equals more power. Of course, it's completely wrong, because in HEMA practice, we're focusing on improving our skill with any sword that we can get. That's why we start with the beginner padded longswords, which are way safer and through which you can build up to in 80% of your total skill in sword fighting. That's what I did. My first 1.5 years, I completely dedicated myself to training with a padded longsword instead of a feather shirt. The next point is that beginners often buy heavy and stiff longsword replicas which are not made for sparring whatsoever. They get hurt and they quit HEMA for good. Yeah, that's not ideal. The next point is that they think that equipment gives you skill, which I already talked about in my first point. It doesn't matter what gear you really have. You can have the basics, the most basic gear imaginable. So the padded longsword and fencing mask. And through that, of course, you're not trying to train thrusting, because padded longswords are not made for safe thrusting. They're good at cutting mechanics. But even with that, you're way better than 99% of people with a sword. The main thing that you have to ingrain into your mind, if you're just starting out sword fighting, it's not about the sword. Like, really, guys, the main thing is not about your sword, it's about you. It's about you being good with any kind of sword, specifically longsword, of course, right? Because if you start to train longsword, then you start training saber. Of course, saber is different, but to be honest, if you're intermediate or even advanced fencer, then you start to see that every sword that you wield is kind of has the same shit, like same mechanics, right? But different nuance. The next beginner mistake that I see is that they skip the fundamentals, which is footwork, control, and timing. Also, they fear sparring because probably they jumped to steal sparring right away, which is a big mistake we want to avoid. So if you're here for real training and real sword fighting skill, then you have to avoid these beginner mistakes. My recommended roadmap for beginners is that you start with the padded longsword first. For around your first 1 month or even up to 5-6 months, you have to focus on practicing and sparring with low gear and a padded longsword. It's the bread and butter of building your fundamentals. It's the bread and butter of building your distance, footwork, and timing. Also, you learn how to stop flinching when you're fighting another human being. And also, this kind of sword lets you spar more often, which is the key to actually becoming a good swordsman. So in month 2, if you own a synthetic sword, you can actually start to use it as well with the padded longsword. So padded longswords are of course way safer in low gear sparring, but the synthetic swords actually give you a bit of more knowledge and control of how blade actually behaves. It lets you start drilling by yourself more controlled techniques while feeling the actual blade. So through that you can improve your edge alignment and structure without sparring. So don't buy a synthetic sword unless you already have one. It's not as safe as a padded longsword, but it's still somewhat useful. So around 4th month and plus, you'll start to think about transitioning to the steel longsword. Only when you've mastered the fundamentals like control, timing, footwork, basic cuts, basic parry, riposte, so defense, then you can start to think about transitioning to the Featherschwert. But also, you have to buy your full HEMA gear equipment as well for safe sparring and training with this kind of sword. And of course, this sword lets you prepare for the HEMA tournaments if you're already an intermediate swordsman, which I really recommend you at least try to go to some tournament because you'll quickly know what actually works and what actually doesn't. Because training in a HEMA club, it lets you win against and lose to the same kind of opponents. But if you go to the tournament, you'll actually reveal for yourself that there's more technique to the sword fighting than you thought. So if you want real guidance and not just waste money on the gear that you don't need at the beginning, then check out the link in the description, my school community, which is made for complete beginners without any skill, without any knowledge, on how to actually start training longsword in historical European martial arts from zero, especially if you're a gamer, because your brain is already trained to actually consume and progress through this kind of thing. But of course, you have to add your body to the whole equation. You just need someone to give you the right roadmap for you, the blueprint for complete beginners. Inside, you'll meet the same guys like you who weren't sure about starting it out, but now are on the good level of actually progress, taking steps into becoming a real swordsman. So check out the link in the description if you're interested. Yeah. And remember, always take the initiative.